In the very helpful and informative sheets that Jack provided us with, there is a phrase on page 6 that notes that the ecumenical councils passed disciplinary canons traditionally accorded an authority in the East far higher than in Western tradition, which distinguishes sharply between the dogmatic authority and infallibility of ecumenical councils and their disciplinary legislation. I will be reflecting on this, just as Archbishop Kirill did in his talk very eloquently. And what I will be saying will in part repeat what Archbishop Kirill already said, but I have a different take on the problem. Anyone who has attempted to teach the history of the ecumenical councils to children and tried to explain the relevance of these councils and their canonical legislation today will know that this is no easy task. Indeed, that these meetings are somehow still important for us today, meetings summoned over 1,000 years ago by emperors of a no longer extant empire on the territory of today's Turkey, is a lofty proposition that requires some explaining. What makes the task difficult is not so much the theology articulated by the councils. Although the complexities of the Trinitarian and Christological controversies are admittedly difficult subject matter for any age group, at least their relevance today goes without saying. The dogmatic formulations of the councils are unchanging truths, as relevant to the Orthodox today as they were then. The truly difficult part of the story is the disciplinary legislation or canons promulgated and or ratified by the councils, which concern everything from how men and women may dress or wear their hair to the interhierarchical status of the Bishop of Constantinople. These canons include the legislation of most of the ecumenical councils and Trulanum is considered an ecumenical council in the Orthodox Church, of 2 additional councils of Constantinople, the so-called canons of the Holy Apostles, those of 10 local councils, and finally of 13 fathers. Most of this collection of canons, as Archbishop Kirill has already told us, was proclaimed binding and normative by the Council of Trullo at the end of the 7th century and by the 7th Ecumenical Council in 787, its present-day version having been completed in the year 883, that is, exactly 1,128 years ago. Produced over 1,000 years ago, this legislation is considered strictly binding and in full force for the entire Orthodox Church today. The references are in my footnotes, and you can read them when this is published. It is also called permanent and rigid, from which we refrain from adding or removing anything. But how can this be so? In what sense can the canons be strictly binding, and in what sense, if any, are they in full force? Several modern-day Orthodox theologians point to the temporal aspect of the canons and even to their changeability according to historical context. But a more widespread idea among the Orthodox seems to be that of the complete rigidity of the Church's canonical legislation. This idea has unfortunately often been coupled with a tendentious vision of the full force of the canons, which inspires some to break away from the Church because of her perceived uncanonical activity. I take the liberty of calling this vision tendentious because it is selective. One professes an unfaltering loyalty to certain canons, for example, to Canon 45 of the Holy Apostles that forbids prayer with heretics, while remaining undisturbed by a multitude of canons that the Orthodox Church has not upheld for centuries. One such group of self-professed true Orthodox went so far as to add the following anathema to the anathemas proclaimed on the Sunday of Orthodoxy. I quote, "To those who mindlessly say that some of the canons of the Holy Councils and the Holy Fathers are old and not important for our salvation, anathema." End of quote. The authors of this anathema may not explicitly say that some of the canons are old and not important for our salvation, but since they simply disregard certain canons, some of which I will point out below, one might encourage the true Orthodox to ask themselves, what are they implicitly saying about these canons by not upholding them? In what follows, I shall offer some reflections on this question, focusing first on the meaning of the term canon, as well as its understanding and function in Orthodox tradition. The rest of this inquiry will look at some examples of presently not upheld canons concerning various aspects of Orthodox liturgy and life, and finally consider the implications of our present-day disregard for their prescriptions. And I will not mention the big questions such as the status of the Patriarch of Constantinople or rebaptism of non-Orthodox. I will deal with canons that deal with everyday life and liturgy. The term canon, or canon, originally meaning any straight rod or bar, a ruler, etc., acquired various ecclesial uses, most of which imply a type of rule or norm. It is interesting to note that in Byzantine canonical codices, which contained both civil and ecclesial legislation, the rules ratified by the church councils have always been called canons, whereas the legislation issued by the emperor was entitled laws, nomi or nomima. Hence, a canon is not a law. Let us reflect further on this distinction. In the sense that we address St. Nicholas as a canon or rule of faith, kanona pisteos, in a well-known prayer to that saint, a canon is understood as an inspiring, ideal example worthy of imitation. In this sense, the canon of faith, the saint, is certainly normative for the Church in the sense that the faith according to which he lived is unchanging. But the extent to which the faithful live according to this canon in practice is varying, depending on every Christian's free will, capacity, situation, and so on. This sense is also implied in the term used for the rules issued or ratified by the councils of the Orthodox Church. They are norms, guidelines, examples according to which the Church measures her decisions and judgments in different times and cases. So, unlike a law, a canon leaves the Church hierarchy a certain degree of freedom to interpret and apply it as a precedent or not. This freedom of the Church vis-à-vis her canons is further enhanced by another concept central to Orthodox jurisprudence, that of oikonomia or economy. The literal meaning of the Greek word oikonomia, comprised of the words oikos, house, and nomos, law, is law of the house. In the New Testament, this word is used in an abstract sense of God's administration of his house, that is, the divine plan for the salvation of the world he created, of divine house building. It can be said that the fundamental meaning of the word oikonomia in the context of canon law designates the obligation of church leaders to decide ecclesiastical questions in accordance with this divine plan or house building for the salvation of the world, or rather, in the spirit of the divine love of mankind, of God's wisdom and of God's will for the salvation of man. It is important to note that here we are not speaking of exceptions to the rule, but of the overall aim of the rules themselves, the building up or oikonomia of the house of God, the Church. So the rules are useful only in as much as and when they serve this, their purpose of oikonomia. According to canon law, the decision as to when and to which degree the rules are to be implemented or not is entrusted to the Church's hierarchy. Thus, the rules do not fetter the Church, but rather are wielded by the Church, so to speak, as tools of construction. For this reason, the non-implementation of certain canons at a certain time does not per se constitute a betrayal of the principles of canon law. It is only a betrayal when it is not truly in the interests of divine economia, when it does not serve the building up of the house of God. The Church's hierarchy can hence decide not only that a given canon is, at the present time, old, but that it is also, for the present, not important for our salvation. Now, despite this principle, we will see that, nonetheless, the state of affairs in Orthodox canon law is confusing for the layman, and is often, that's why the canons are often abused. But I'll come to that at the end of this paper. With this in mind, I now turn your attention to some of the canons that are not implemented by the Church today. I should note that it is not my objective to evaluate whether the non-implementation of these canons is justified or not according to the principle of economia. As indicated above, that is the job of the Church's hierarchy. I merely intend to point out two things. One, that these canons exist in the official binding canonical legislation of the Orthodox Church, and two, that they are not implemented. In doing so, it is not my intention to somehow belittle Orthodox tradition, but on the contrary, to rediscover it in a differentiated understanding of its living significance, an understanding that differentiates that which is truly our tradition from that which has become a dead letter. I begin with the canons concerning the liturgy. The first thing one notices when reviewing all the canons concerning the liturgy is how surprisingly few they are. There is not only very little canonical legislation regarding the liturgy, the few liturgical canons mostly regulate minor details that seem too minor to have occupied an entire council. In any event, several of our few liturgical canons have no effect on Orthodox liturgical practice today, neither in parishes nor in monasteries. For example, Canon 15 of the Council of Laodicea, convened in about 363-364, that is, 1,647 years ago, in the southwest region of today's Turkey, allows only ordained chanters to sing in church, explicitly indicating that, quote, no others should sing in church. Canon 14 of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, convened not far from this beautiful city, in the city of Nicaea, today's Iznik, in 787, precisely 1,224 years ago, says the same thing about reading in church, that it is only allowable for the ordained. While most of us have never even heard of the ordination of singers, with unordained men, women, and children singing in our churches, we do have ordained readers, but they are in no wise the only ones doing the reading in church as the canon of the cited Ecumenical Council prescribes. Canon 50 of the same Council of Laodicea, as well as Canon 29 of the Council of Trullo from the end of the 7th century, prohibit any mitigation of the strict fast called xerophagia, literally the eating of dry food, with no wine and no oil, on Holy Thursday. These canons originally targeted the widespread ancient custom of eating before the Divine Liturgy on Holy Thursday. Since on Holy Thursday at the Last Supper, Christ established the Eucharist after having eaten, metato dipnise, it was believed to be appropriate to eat before the Eucharist on this one day in the year. But these canons went further than to simply prohibit eating before the Eucharist on Holy Thursday. They insist on the strict form of fasting with no wine and no oil, xerophagia, after the Eucharist on Holy Thursday. For this reason, the influential late Byzantine abbot and ascetic writer Nikon of the Black Mountain was opposed to allowing oil on Holy Thursday, citing the above-mentioned 50th canon of Laodicea. Yet, in the Slavonic typikon we follow today, oil and wine are officially allowed on Holy Thursday. Also, in the case of the strict fast on the eve of Theophany, when it falls on a Sunday, our typikon contradicts Canon 1 of Theophilus of Alexandria, the famous or infamous uncle of Saint Kirill of Alexandria. He died in 412. While Theophilus only allows the consumption of several dates on a Sunday that happens to be on the eve of Theophany, the typikon allows for wine and oil. Thus, the typikon itself disregards at least two canons, one of a council considered ecumenical in the Orthodox Church, and another of Theophilus of Alexandria, whose 14 canons, though he is not considered a saint, were ratified by the ecumenical councils and entered our official canonical codex. Now, I have never heard of anybody leaving the Russian Church today because of the uncanonical prescriptions of her typikon. Indeed, the breach of canonical legislation regarding the niceties of fasting rules probably seems insignificant to most of us. I will parenthetically note, however, that in the 11th to 15th centuries, the exact fasting rules for Wednesdays and Fridays, coinciding with major and minor feasts, were the cause of intense disagreements and even divisions in the churches of Constantinople and Rus. In the 11th century, patriarchs of Constantinople were repeatedly compelled to issue decrees on the subject, while somewhat later in Kiev, several councils tried in vain to resolve the same issue. In 1157, the bishop of Rostov, Nestor, was banished by his flock from his city for mitigating the Wednesday and Friday fast only in the cases of Theophany and Christmas, but not for other feasts. Several years later, Bishop Leon of the same city was banished for not mitigating this fast even for Theophany and Christmas. The Russian chronicler calls Leon's position the Leonian heresy, Leontianskaya Yeris. Yet another Russian bishop, Theodoret, proved unpopular for upholding the opposite practice of abolishing the Wednesday and Friday fast in the case of all feasts. There is evidently nothing novel or difficult about breaking with one's bishop on the basis of rules and regulations, no matter how minor. But in doing so, dissenters of different eras seem to differ in their particular selection of the rules on which they focus according to concerns of their time. Very often disregarded are Canons 22 and 23 of that same Council of Laodicea. I keep mentioning these canons because Laodicea has an uncommonly large number of liturgical canons, which forbid readers, singers, and the lower altar ministrants to wear the orarion. The orarion is given only to deacons who wear it on one shoulder and to subdeacons who wear it crosswise over both shoulders. Nonetheless, today it is especially popular at pontifical celebrations of the Russian Orthodox Church to have at least several non-ordained altar boys assisting the hierarch at the service wearing oraria crosswise like subdeacons. You could see any number of pictures in the internet of Russian pontifical celebrations that prove my point. To this, or illustrate it, to this list of largely ignored liturgical canons, we could add Canon 69 of the Council of Trullo, which forbids all laity, except the emperor, to enter the sanctuary. I must say I have never seen a parish in which this canon was upheld. I have not seen cases of women breaking this rule, but men and boys who assist the priest in some way or other come in and out of the sanctuary as needed. Would it somehow be more a breach of the canon, I'll just ask hypothetically, were women to do the same? Or is a breach of a canon a breach of a canon? These are rhetorical questions. To point out some more uncanonical activity that, to my knowledge, goes unpunished by prescribed canonical sanctions in our parishes and monasteries, Canon 9 of the Holy Apostles, from the end of the 4th century, prescribes excommunication to those who leave the divine liturgy before it We all witnessed an Orthodox liturgy yesterday. I don't know whether the patriarch excommunicated a lot of people yesterday, but he came quickly to that monastery to serve the Trisagion, so I assume that he did not. Excuse me. Canon 2, going on, of the Council of Antioch from approximately 333, excommunicates those who do not take Holy Communion at the Divine Liturgy and forbids the faithful to have any contact with such non-communicating people. I should also mention the well-known Canon 80 of Trulanum that subjects to excommunication anyone who has neglected to go to church for 3 Sundays in a row for no justifiable reason. If we were to adhere to this canon, those who show up in church only for Christmas and Easter and wish to go to confession and communion should be turned away from the chalice. But this is not what happens as far as I have observed. Last but not least, there is the much discussed, as of late, Canon 3 of Dionysius of Alexandria, composed, it is presumed, in 262. That means about 1,750 years ago. I mean, I know that old is a relative term, but we could probably call this old, forbidding a woman both to enter a church and to receive communion whenever she has her period, because she is, quote, not wholly clean, both in soul and in body. Today, this canon is rarely adhered to. That is, today women are usually allowed, now the practices vary greatly, but I say usually, at least in the United States or in Russia. That is, today women are usually allowed to enter churches at all times of the month, though barred from receiving communion, and often also from confession, though that's not always the case, during menstruation. But that is not what the canon prescribes. The main objective of this canon, as formulated in its beginning, is to answer the question, quote, whether menstruating women ought to enter the temple of God. That's how Dionysius begins the canon. Concerning menstruous women, whether they ought to enter the temple of God while in such a state, I think it's superfluous even to put the question. I will not quote the whole thing. And so he answers this question in the negative. So when barring women from Holy Communion, but at the same time allowing them to come to church, as is often our practice today, one should not refer to Canon 3 of Dionysius, because in allowing menstruating women to enter the church, one is discarding the tradition described by Dionysius and replacing it with a new one. Indeed, pastoral practice has taken the liberty of correcting the decision of the Alexandrinian father. It has thus implicitly criticized the canon and reformed it. And yet, it has been my experience that Orthodox tend to be deeply disturbed by any effort to explicitly question the theological soundness of Dionysius's canon. It is as if criticism and reform are allowed in practice as long as they are not articulated in theological reflection. In any case, as we have seen above, Orthodox liturgical practice does enjoy a rather robust tradition of completely disregarding a number of its liturgical canons. Even the Typicon disregards certain canons as we have seen. So, disregarding Canon 3 of Dionysius is not in principle as revolutionary or as untraditional an idea as some may fear. I will now take a look at some of the forgotten canons concerning areas not directly tied to liturgy. My personal favorite is Canon 11 of the Council of Trullo from the end of the 7th century that forbids eating certain wafers manufactured by Jews, befriending Jews, seeking medical care from anyone of the Jewish faith, or bathing with them in public beaches or bathhouses. I quote, "Let no one enrolled in the sacerdotal list or any layman eat the unleavened wafers manufactured by the Jews, or in any way become familiar with the Jews, or call them in case of sickness, or take any medicines from them, or even bathe with them in public bathing beaches or bathhouses. If anyone should attempt to do this, in case he is a clergyman, let him be deposed from office, or in case he is a layman, let him be excommunicated." End of quote. Do any Orthodox today ever think to confess the uncanonical seeking of medical advice from Jewish surgeons or physicians? I won't ask for a show of hands, but any of you from the New York area ever go to Jones Beach and see if there are any Jews? Could we imagine avoiding public beaches frequented by Jews, or avoiding in any way becoming familiar with the Jews? I remind you that the cited canon was promulgated by an ecumenical council. The local council held in Constantinople in the Church of Hagia Sophia in 879, whose legislation entered the official canonical codex of the Orthodox Church, in its second canon proclaims the incompatibility of monasticism and hierarchical rank. More precisely, the canon forbids bishops from taking monastic vows, especially because they include the obligations of penitence and obedience that are deemed inappropriate for hierarchical dignity. So the canon decrees, I quote, that if any bishop or anyone else with a hierarchical office is desirous of descending to monastic life and of taking on the position of penance, let him no longer seek to enjoy hierarchical dignity, because the vows of monks include the obligations of subordination and pupilship, and not of teachership and presidency, nor do they undertake to pastor others. End of quote. Does this canon contradict today's practice of ordaining bishops who are monastics? Modern-day Orthodox commentators stress that the canon forbids taking vows after hierarchical ordination, that is, descending, as the canon states, to monastic life from the dignity of hierarchical rank, and thus conclude that it presents no problem for the practice of assuming the monastic tonsure before being ordained. While some commentators specify that this canon forbids only the tonsure of the great schema, mega schema, and not the initial monastic ranks of Rasofor or small schema, others even allow for one who has received the great schema to be ordained bishop. The medieval commentators, on the other hand, see no difference in this case between the great or small schemas. The 12th century commentator Balsamon even explicitly stresses that here neither the small nor the great schema make any difference for the point in question, nor do Zonaras and Aristenus make any such distinction, because the principle promulgated by the canon is plainly the incompatibility of any form of monasticism insofar as it includes the vow of obedience and penance with the hierarchical office. It would seem that this incompatibility arises regardless of whether the monastic vows are taken before or after the hierarchical ordination, if one presumes that the vows are taken for life. In both cases, the end result is a monk who is also a bishop. Does today's tradition of monastics being ordained bishops assume that the ordination absolves the monastic from these vows? Or does today's practice disagree in principle with the principle proclaimed by the 9th century canon? That is, that monasticism is incompatible with hierarchical dignity. I remind you that I am not arguing against today's centuries-old tradition. I only wish to indicate that it is not the tradition reflected in the canon. According to canons 59 of the Holy Apostles and 24 of the Council of Laodicea, as mentioned earlier, in the southwest region of today's Turkey in 363-364, it is forbidden for a monastic or a cleric of any rank, including priest, deacon, singer, reader, church porter, it says thiroros, and so on, to eat in a tavern or a restaurant, the term used is kapilion, or even to enter one, except in case of necessity while traveling, and although the anangin. Actually, the latter exception in the case of traveling, I saw everybody breathe a sigh of relief, but this exception is made only by one of these canons, Canon 54 of the Holy Apostles, while Canon 24 of Laodicea non-equivocally forbids clerics to enter restaurants at any time. One may argue that the type of restaurant or kapilion, tavern, meant by these canons composed in the 4th century is not equivalent to today's restaurants. And I will concede that a 4th century tavern in southwest Turkey or Asia Minor was probably rather different from a McDonald's, TGI Fridays, or a typical American diner, though I have not studied the question sufficiently. However, there are doubtlessly some similarities in principle between being a cleric and eating out today and what these canons are forbidding. The present-day American diner has music, usually, right, not of the church kind. There are men and women of all walks of life. There are waitresses that call you darling, and so on. In any case, it has been my experience in Europe, the United States, Russia, Greece, and now Turkey, that it is not considered somehow wrong, and certainly not uncanonical, for clerics and also monastics to eat from time to time in restaurants. Canon 96 of Trullanum targets excessive or alluring hairstyles. It prescribes excommunication to those baptized, quote, who arrange and dress the hair of their head by contriving to braid or wave it in a fashion which has disastrous effects on beholders, and hence offers allure to unbolstered souls. The authors of the canon further explain their objective in composing this canon: to encourage the braiders and wavers of hair, quote, to adorn the inner rather than the outer man with virtues and benignant and blameless manners, so that they may not have any trace left in them of the rudeness of the adversary. It is interesting to note that the medieval commentators understood this canon and its excommunication to mostly concern the hairstyles of men and not of women. According to Zonaras, it targets those men who, quote, let their hair grow long enough to reach the belt like that of women, and those who bleach it so as to make it blonde or golden, or who put wigs or hair pieces on their head. It also concerns, according to Zonaras, those who, quote, shave off their beard in order to make their face smooth and handsome. And he voices his dismay that priests actually allow such men to approach the chalice. I mention the medieval commentary alongside the 7th century canon only to stress how different the pastoral perspective is in our time. It has certainly not changed that a Christian strives to adorn the inner rather than the outer man with virtues and benignant and blameless manners, and that one should not arrange and dress the hair so as to offer a lure to unbolstered souls. However, is there any attempt to direct the faithful, let alone excommunicate them, on the subject of improper hairstyle decisions? I have not seen any evidence of such a concern in any parishes that I have been to, where, as far as I have observed, clean-shaven faces and, what is much worse, male hairpieces go unpunished. I come to my concluding remarks. It may have become obvious from the above-mentioned examples that not everything in the canonical codex of the Orthodox Church has the same significance and importance for the life of the Church today. It is also clear that modern-day Church practice either simply mitigates or modifies the prescriptions of certain canons, while contradicting others in principle. Despite the leeway given by economia and the proper understanding of the term canon, the fact that as it stands, the canonical codex, it is the cause of confusion. There appears to be a dire need for a systematic hierarchy of canons that would distinguish those that are of timeless importance from those that are not. But as it stands, Orthodox canon law does not have such a system. There have been attempts. For example, there was a very interesting metropolitan of Transylvania, Metropolitan Andrei Shaguna, that attempted such a hierarchy of canons, but that has not had much influence in the Orthodox Church. And this results in significant confusion over the binding nature and full force of the canons. As mentioned at the beginning of this paper, the resulting confusion more tragically leads to schisms within the Church. In view of this tragedy, it has in no wise been my objective to weaken or devalue an appreciation for the tradition of the Orthodox Church. It was rather my hope to dispense with a misguided view of tradition that has proved destructive to the Church's unity. Thank you.